profesora que ha hecho que muchos alumnos hagan tesis sobre mis libros. Es querida amiga, ha escrito muchísimo sobre mis libros. Y cuando Maggie la presenta, dice, ella es la que inventó a Alberto. Y ahora ella fundó un instituto de estudios españoles y portugueses, como el de ustedes, en la Universidad Mohamed Sank, y que el instituto sigue vivo, ahora lo dirige Fatija Bellabá. Y Umama es embajadora de Marruecos en Panamá ahora.
Wow.
Panamá.
Qué gusto de verte, Umama.
Hola, Alberto.
¿Quién habla?
Me llamo Guillermo Ríos y ya que están en la hora de las presentaciones y para llenar los silencios,
Hola, Guillermo.
Soy escritor de cine. Entre mis trabajos está la película más exitosa de la historia, que se llama No se aceptan devoluciones. Y también escribí una serie que se llama Capadocia para HBO. Bueno. Entre muy otros trabajos, también escribo telenovelas y sigo tu trabajo con mucho gusto y con muchas ganas de abrir y aprender.
No, pues me alegra mucho conocerte, Guillermo. Muchas gracias.
Ok.
Una pregunta rápida a Guillermo. ¿Capadocia es documental o es otro género?
No es ficción, es totalmente ficción.
Ok.
Salvador.
Sí.
Gracias.
Tengo que salir tantito, ahorita regreso.
Ok.
Sí, veo más gente conocida. María Sada es una gran pintora mexicana que me regaló el cuadro de las cabras de los árboles de Marruecos, de Bogador, que tengo aquí. Déjame sacarlo, no lo preparé. Esto debería ponerlo como fondo mejor, pero no sé si se va a ver.
Sí, a veces...
No, pero no se ve lo lindo que es.
Okay.
Ya sé lo que hay que hacer, lo tengo que poner encima de mí.
Exacto, sí, así sí.
Esta es obra de María Sada, que la veo por ahí. ¿Y quién más está? Bueno, Beatriz Tamayo, esa es mi prima, ¿eres mi prima? Bueno, tiene cerrado el micrófono, supongo que sí.
Yo me llamo Héctor Ríos, saludos a todos. Simplemente soy un apasionado de la historia de México y me interesó mucho el tema, ver qué posibles raíces puedan estar por ahí de musulmanas en nuestra historia.
Qué bueno, mucho gusto.
Hola, Alberto. Yo simplemente soy una admiradora tuya, te sigo, te leo y me encanta estar aquí contigo.
¿Quién eres?
Gina Trujillo.
Ah, Gina, ¿cómo estás? Claro, bueno, ya me entrevistaste
en alguna ocasión.
Sí, claro. Sí. No, me da mucho gusto verte, Gina. Marianne Jalil también. Hola. No, pues mucha gente conocida, me alegra muchísimo.
Hola, hola.
Veo que hay 80 personas, es mucho. Más los que están en YouTube, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, pues me da mucho gusto.
¿Tú quieres empezar, Berenice, o cómo quieres?
Pronto, nada más si quieres vamos a darte un poquito de...
Sí. Muy bien, está muy bien, perfecto.
Y yo creo que lo que sí es que vamos a hacer un poquito de mute nada más en lo que comenzamos.
Sí.
Ya.
Veo que hay gente que habla solo inglés, ¿verdad? Ese es el tema, ¿no? Aquí me están llegando mensajes. Muy bien. Pues a sus órdenes.
Vamos.
Cuando tú digas
verte final, porque habíamos hablado por teléfono, pero no te había visto, Alberto. Entonces, gustazo.
¿Quién habla?
Salvador.
Ah, sí, Salvador. Y tenemos además pendiente todavía una conversación, ¿verdad?
Sí, ya está muy platicada. Ya están esperándola, ya está anunciada, de hecho, en la
Muchas gracias.
Biblioteca Pública de Toronto, sí.
Todo esto es también por iniciativa tuya, así es que muchas gracias.
No, encantado.
Ok. ¿Cómo ven? ¿Comenzaremos?
Yo creo que sí, ¿no?
Ok. Sí, porque si no se nos va a hacer muy tarde.
Sí.
Vamos a comenzar muy tarde. Muy bien. Entonces, un segundo.
Hola, hola.
And, oh, wait. Which one I'm sharing? Oh, sorry. Sorry. I have a few presentations open. So now, okay. So,
¿Puedo decir unas palabras?
no, ya vamos a comenzar.
Ah, gracias.
Perdón. Perdón. Ok, muy bien. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, the third and last one in the Islam and Latin American series, organized by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Institute for Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. We are very happy to see you tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Berenice Villagomez, and I am the undergraduate coordinator at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I'll be one of your hosts tonight. Before we move on, I would like to make a land acknowledgement, as is custom here at the University of Toronto. So I would want to mention that as we engage in remote communications via email, video conferences, or remote learning, I acknowledge the debt that I have incurred and that is amassing each time I open my laptop computer. We are all indebted to those peoples and communities whose waters and lands have been poisoned as a result of the extraction of metals and rare earth elements required to fabricate the machinery through which we speak to, hear from, and view each other. We are indebted to those peoples whose working lives, youth, and vitality have been spent in unsafe spaces and intolerable conditions, so that so many citizens of the so-called developed world might have easy access to these technologies. As we encounter each other through our email accounts, our messaging apps, our virtual meeting rooms, and chat rooms, let us strive to remain mindful of the incalculable debt we owe. So thank you again for joining us today. We're Our Islam and Latin American series began a couple of years ago, whereas my colleague Amber Eamon over here and me share a kitchen in the same floor at the Jackman Humanities building where we both have our offices. So once in a while, chatting over coffee or tea, we started talking a little bit about how similar things were happening to both Latin Americans and Latinos in the US with, the separation of families and people being put in cages, and the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China at the time that they were also being sort of like in concentration camps. And then we continued chatting, commenting the news, and we noticed also how the war on terror and the war on drugs have, unfortunately, the two sides of a kind of like a same coin of oppression against people. So we started noticing that there are a lot of things, unfortunately, common in this contemporary world between our constituents. And we reached out to the Office of the Vice President of International at the University of Toronto, and they very generously supported this project for us. So we have a 3-year project. We started last year with the most contemporary issues. So we kicked off our series with an event on the September 11th. For those of us who are of Latin American origin, we are very aware of the repercussions of the coup d'etat against Chilean President Salvador Allende in September 11, 1973. And everyone throughout the world is now very aware of the consequences of the terrorist attacks against the US on September 11, 2001. So that very first event was a reflection on ways that the world has changed with these two events. A little after that, how the policing started after that. Then for February 14, and very close to Carnaval that year, we organized an event to reflect on the ways that communities police themselves, not an external force, an international force, but rather policing themselves. And one of the ways that these communities do that is through the policing of sexuality. And being that Carnaval is such, loud and transgressive idea, we thought that this would be a wonderful time to do it. So we brought together performers, both musical and drag performers from both communities, both from Muslim communities and Latin American communities. And it was a wonderful event that our students enjoyed very much. And lastly, we received the visit of Professor Arun Kutnani, and he spoke to us about how the war on terror and the war on drugs are nothing more than racial capitalism. And it was also a fascinating talk. We're very grateful for that. This year, our focus was on migrations, and it was very odd since, with the pandemic, nobody can go anywhere. But the topic had been already decided. So instead of talking about the impossibilities right now of migration, we decided to take a look at art. This year has been very difficult for all of us, and art is definitely something that brings us immense joy, or has the capacity to bring immense joy. So we decided to go and look a little bit to that. So this year we have already hosted Professor Tamara Walker from our own university in the Department of History. And she told us about how Arabs in Latin America have entered the artistic imagination, which was also a really good event. And 2 weeks ago, we had the pleasure of receiving Professor Farzaneh Pirous, where she talked to us about the migration, literally, of how tin-glazed ceramics that had their origins in Iraq, or what is now Iraq, came all the way across the sea to become what is now known as Talavera in Mexico. And it was also a wonderful presentation of arts and ceramics. And today we have our last event for this year. Again, we're delighted to have Alberto Ruiz Sanchez here with us to extend a little more that bridge of sand that he speaks of, el puente de arena, and talk a little more about how Islamic cultures have deeply influenced Mexican life for us today. So we thank you, Alberto, for coming today. I want to mention again that this event is co-organized by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese through its Latin American Studies program and the Institute for Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. We also want to thank sincerely our good friend and colleague Salvador Alanis, founder and director of the Institute for Cultural Exchange, or ICE Americas. And we also want to thank Rodrigo Mendivil, who is the cultural attaché of the Consulate General of Mexico in Toronto. Thank you so much for your support and your promotion of the event. We really appreciate. And obviously to the Office of the Vice President of International at the University of Toronto for their generous support of this series. So before wanted to mention, please follow us on social media to be aware of the events that will happen next year. Alberto's talk is marvelous in many ways, not only because he's closing this year, but it's also a bit of an inauguration for next year. Our third and last year on this series will look at the first encounters of this culture. So we're going to go back historically all the way to Al-Andalus, and we're going to look at historical and legal and many of these wonderful encounters, exchanges that happen back in the last millennium. Literally, oh my God, when I say it that way, it sounds horrible. But please follow us on social media. Spanish and Portuguese, we're active in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can also find a podcast run by our students in Spotify. And as some of you might be right now looking in our YouTube channel. And the Institute of Islamic Studies is also active on Twitter. So please be sure to give us a follow. Now, before I continue, I just wanted to show you briefly something. So I want to introduce our speaker today, but I wanted to say something before I do, sort of like the most formal introduction. Alberto doesn't know this, but the first time we met was in 2006. Alberto was the keynote speaker at a conference of Mexican studies in El Paso, Texas. And back then he had published one of his, at the time, the latest book was Nueve veces el asombro back then. And I have the proof. I have this autographed by Alberto. At the time, I was a graduate student attending one of my first conferences, my first academic conferences with our wonderful colleagues in the University of Texas at El Paso. And as many of you have already or are about to become completely enchanted by Alberto. So back then, I bought Nueve veces el asombro. He signed it for me. I went to my hotel room and I started reading it. And it was so engrossing that I actually forgot that I was supposed to meet a couple of friends for dinner. It was delightful, a way to transport. And El Quinteto de Mogador, which is, the quintet of novels that he will talk to us a little bit later, is the kind of literature that is so fascinating always, but is so necessary now. As many of you might know, Alberto has such a poetic writing, and the way that he constructs this city of Mogador is exactly what I need to get away of Toronto's horrible winter in lockdown in the middle of the pandemic. So it's thank you again. I reread the books again as we were talking, and I want to say thank you. Somebody like Alberto is difficult to pinpoint when you're trying to say something about him, but I'll make my best effort just for those of you who are not familiar with Alberto yet. So if we want to give a very academic introduction, well, Alberto is an acclaimed Mexican author of fiction and nonfiction and poetry. He has won a ridiculous amount of prizes. Alberto, leave something for the rest of the writers, please. But it's a fantastic writing. He was the managing editor of Vuelta, was one of the most important cultural phenomena in Spanish from 1984 to 1987. And after 87, started in 1988, he became the chief editor and founding publisher of Artes de Mexico. Artes de Mexico are fantastic magazines. If you're not aware of them, look for them. They cover all topics related to art. This one is one of my favorites. It's about a Mexican ceramist, Gustavo Perez, but any topic that you want, you can find a volume of Artes de Mexico there. Also beautifully edited, they're, for those of you who don't know them, exquisite photography, exquisite layout. The essays that accompany are always enlightening. And there's usually also a translation of the main points of the magazine at the back in English. So, if you want to say, this is beautiful, but I don't know what it's saying, you can actually find them, Artes de Mexico. And if you think these are not enough credentials, he has a PhD also from the University of Paris, where he took writing seminars. His thesis director was Roland Barthes. He studied with Michel Foucault and Jacques Rancière and André Chastel. So again, it's very difficult to encompass you in so little, but I'm going to stop now and actually let you enjoy Alberto's presentation. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy this, and thank you for joining us again. Alberto.
Thank you so much, Berenice. Your presentation is very moving. You leave me without words. Thank you so much. For me, it was very important that meeting in El Paso. I have been invited 3 times to the Institute, and the school in El Paso became the main school giving an education of specialists on Mexico. So in most of the American universities and Canadian universities, as you are now, the people who is in charge of studying Mexico, introducing Mexican writers, comes from that school now. They used to come from another school in Kansas, but the professor died, and now the turn is for the El Paso school. So I'm so happy to recognize you here. Thank you, Berenice, for remembering that. Well, I have to begin, of course, thanking the University of Toronto for the invitation to be with you today, the Spanish and Portuguese Department and its Institute of Islamic Studies for making me part of this remarkable Islamic and Latin America series, especially Berenice Villagomez, Amber Eamon, and the person who put us in touch, the poet Salvador Alanis. I will also thank the consulate, even my friend, the consul Thierry Muñoz Ledo was giving advertisement for this lecture. He was ambassador of Mexico in Morocco. I visited him there. Maybe you remember, Umama, that he was there. And I see also that there is another consul that, before being consuls, all of them are friends of our generation, of my generation. Well, I'm a little bit older than them. It's Alberto Fierro, mi tocayo, who used to be the director of the Mexican Cultural Institute in Washington, and now he's in Denver, I think. It's in Denver? You're in Denver, Alberto? Well, I see a lot of people I know, and one of the things that Umama Wad made was to open a space for people studying and taking care of my books in Morocco. A lot of people. There is no trip I made to Morocco without meeting by chance any of the students that you put there. And the institute that you invented have very interesting people studying Mexican literature and studying other subjects. I see here Raja El-Hamsi, that is also from that group. Fatiha Bellaba, who is the substitute you as a dean of that institute, is not here, but if my books are translated into Arabic, is thanks to the work of Fatiha, and thanks to the initiative of Umama, and thanks to the friendship and interest of Andrea Soule, who is really one of the most remarkable persons that we can meet in the Arabic world, who's a counselor of the king, and he is the one in great part responsible that the city of Mogador exists as beautiful as it is now. In one of the many attempts against the beauty of the city, they built a mall in one part of the walls. Some people built a wall, and thanks to the association that Andrea and the support of a lot of people, the mall went down. It's like if you construct a mall in front of the walls of the Alhambra. No, it's something that monstrous, but that happens, and that happens everywhere. So I'm very happy to see you here and to thank you for all that. I have to say first to all the people who doesn't know me, there's a lot of people, most of the people here know anything about me, that I will address you as a writer, not precisely as a scholar. Even having the credentials for that, I prefer to think of myself as a storyteller who is at the same time a poet and in the same movement of speech and spirit, an essayist. I believe that the generic distinctions are cultural, more artificial than natural, decided once, but many times just take it for granted. Almost always, my books, once written, have been classified differently by publishers in other cultures. One of them, for example, Nueve veces el asombro, the one that Berenice had in her hands now, was first published in Spain as a poem in a poetry magazine. In France and Quebec, it was published as a novel, a roman, Neuf fois neuf choses que l'on dit de Mogador. And in the first edition, they announced that it was not translated, not from Spanish, but as in France say, it was translated from Mexican. And in English, as a work of non-fiction, the same book, brilliantly translated by Rhonda Buchanan, even in the title as Poetics of Wonder, Passage to Mogador, a travel book that was also philosophy. So you have poetry, a narrative, and an essay. Maybe not by chance, this enveloping way of writing coincides with the Arabic conception of the adab. And there I begin to talk about how the Arabic culture marks my work. And the concept of adab, A-D-A-B, as it evolved and was formulated in the Andalusian 11th century in a work like El Collar de la Paloma, the collar of the dove or the ring of the dove, both translations exist, by Ibn Hazm, a work of philosophy of love told with a narrative and highly poetical impulse. The adab went from being a moral lesson, a precept, to a powerful literary creation, blending consciously astonishment with understanding, rigorous reasoning with poetic and narrative composition, a form adding to an idea the freedom of being read in a very personal way. If the precept fixes the sense of what is written, the adab opens the possibility of being read in many ways. And that, with the fusion of the different genres, is what matters me and what I take as my flag to write in Spanish. In the few minutes I will share with you, and you will discover that if you don't pay attention, I talk too much. Berenice, remember to tell me that the hour will come to an end. I will take you through a journey that began for me several years ago. Sorry? In the few minutes I'll share with you, I will take you through a journey that began for me several years ago in my first trip to Morocco, and continued in my books, and continued each time I go to an Islamic country. The force, the deep trace that Morocco left in me allows me now to read the enormous differences with all the Islamic world. When I give to this lecture the title, Deep Traces of Islamic Culture, I have to explain, or maybe I don't have to the people who know that, but not many people knows it, that there is many Islamic cultures. There is really a lot of Islamic cultures. And one of my battles with many people in Mexico is that what they call the Orient, or what they call the culture of the Middle East, has nothing to do with the culture of the south of Spain in the Arabic times, or the culture of Morocco. Morocco belongs to a region named in Arabic Maghrib, which means Occident. The people who doesn't get that difference cannot understand anything about what kind of Islamic culture is alive in Morocco more than the Spanish inhabitants think in Spain, and much more alive in Mexico. I will tell you how. But I have to explain also that when I talk of Islamic culture, thinking of the Maghrebi culture, there is deep traces also from the most powerful of the Arabic world that comes, as Farsi explained in the last lecture, even from Persia, even from the ancient Iran in the technology of the pottery, for example. But there is many others. But most of that, more than that, I need to explain what I understand by deep traces. What is a deep trace of Islamic culture? Much more than an imitation, and very often we have in Mexico, in Latin America, and even when I've been in the universities in the United States, the idea that if my novels are placed in Mogador, in a port of the Atlantic Sea in the west of Morocco, there is a link, immediate link with the 1,001 Nights. And that is very far. It's not exactly what I have in mind. But people, the commonplace is to think that anything that is Arabic is linked to the book they have in mind, which, by the way, is a wonderful book. And it's been a lot of versions. It is in an anthology of many stories. And one of the more interesting editions of the 1,001 Nights was made by a Moroccan and Algerian writer with a French specialist in Arabic culture, with André Miquel. And this writer already died, but I met him in Mogador thanks to Umama and in one of the meetings we had. And he established the huge difference between what I'm trying to describe as a deep trace. Let me put an example. For example, a not deep trace is, for example, one of the hotels in Tehuantepec that have in the middle of their main yard an imitation of the Fountain of the Lions of Alhambra. That is really like a naive, even kitsch quotation. Not deep trace is many of the arabesque decorations in many of the houses of the Porfirio Diaz time, the beginning of the 20th century. That is not really a deep trace. A deep trace for me is something that was perceived by Luce López Baralt in the poetry of San Juan de la Cruz. For her, following the teachings of her professor, Miguel Asim Palacios, who studied the traces, the deep traces of Islamic philosophy in Dante, Luce López Baralt followed the track and found how in the way of writing poetry of San Juan de la Cruz, there is some apparently technical, but more deeply forms that means also a meaning. The form is a meaning. the idea that we find also in other mystics in the Spanish language, the idea of the interior, the soul as a succession of interior castles, is absolutely Arabic. It's a trace of the Arabic culture. The idea of that is one of the more erotic and strongest images in the Spanish poetry of all times, the idea of the soul burning, melting with the god in the same fire, described with poetical force, not only told as a concept, but described with the force of the poetry as no other genre can do it. That is Arabic. And that is linked to the poetry and to the adab also, to this fusion I was talking to you at the beginning. I will allow me to remember a meeting we had, Umama, do you remember, organized by UNESCO and by André Azoulay in Morocco, in one of the universities very close to Fez. And it was called a meeting of the three religions. There was people, very Orthodox people from the Jewish communities, very Orthodox people from Catholic communities, and the Islamic community. And they were having a congress trying to build bridges between the three different religions of the book. It was a congress about that. And as I was invited with Umama, I made a speech on what I found as the real, only absolute thing that the three things have in common, besides believing in one God. Even if all of them think in a different God, and some liberals inside the religion think that it's the same. For me, the real thing united the three religions is mystical poetry. The speech that describes, not describes, but puts in action through the words, the act of melting yourself with your God, if you are a believer, is formulated in a very similar way in the three religions. And it is so because the three religions have taken one from the other the ways of saying that, which means, talking of mystical poetry, the ways of doing that, of getting in touch with your God. If we become heretic and we think of this link with the sacred as an erotic act, we arrive to the idea of the people making love is making a ritual by which is building the other, the loved one, as sacred, as a goddess or as a god. That's absolutely heretic. But I do believe that. But for my astonishment, do you remember, Umama, the main character in that meeting was a prince, a Jordan prince. And he was furious against the idea of giving a place to poetry in that meeting. He said, poetry is useless and poetry is not important. Important is ethics, theology, anything. He was a prince. And then this same writer make a defense of the poetry. The writer who made the edition of the 1001 Nights. Do you remember his name, Umama? I don't remember. Well, he made a defense of the poetry as really what I was proposing, the link between the three religions. So returning to the concept of deep traces, for me, that is a deep trace. And the idea that we can learn something from another culture is including our another cultures, all the indigenous cultures inside Mexico, is important if you think of that as a lesson to live by, as an instrument to give sense to your life, as a way of making yours a culture, something of a culture to give a sense to your life. And I have the feeling that that happened in Mexico since many centuries ago in many ways. And that happened to me when I was looking for my own voice. Because the journey I am trying to describe you was a journey that I took with Margarita de Orellana, my wife, who is co-editor of Artes de Mexico. And that journey was a search of two things. One was trying to understand woman's desire, because I was beginning to live with her. And I have, or had more at the time, the education of any Mexican, which is made of many blocks, many exterior castles that doesn't allow us to understand so much. But at the same time, I was looking for my own voice as a writer. I come from a generation that began to write when 100 Years of Solitude was out. And all of my generation, in one impulse, was imitating Garcia Marquez for once. So there is a lot of magical realism. What they were imitating a lot, Jose Agustin. So they became very old, writing as if they were 13 years old and talking about their neighborhood, thinking that that is more real than talking about anywhere else, inventing their neighborhood. Or they grow imitating something that is impossible, Juan Rulfo. But the imitation of Rulfo allowed many writers to talk about the terrible reality of violence. I do believe that most of the writers, and there is a lot of them that write about narcos and all that, are the mistaken sons of Juan Rulfo. And I was trying to find my own voice and to understand, because I wanted to continue living with that woman and try to understand what it meant to understand what was happening in the mind of women. And one of the things that was important, I will not talk much more about that because it's like a whole other lecture, but we can discuss a little bit, but is that the women in Morocco have a very different situation than the women in other countries, of course, but their freedom as their limitations is coded in another way. One of the more important things for me was to hear those women, to listen to those women. And one of the things that I thank Umama, that one of the first to write about my books, is that I gave to the feminine characters the personality of people having desires, not only being desired. It is a commonplace in all Oriental literature. Well, the deep traces of the Mexican, of the deep traces of the Arabic world in me and then in Mexico were introduced to me in this first trip, but I received them before arriving to Morocco. I received them in the ship because I was forced to take, at the time, I'm so old, you can't imagine, that when I went to Morocco for the first time, Franco was alive. And for a few months, Mexicans were not allowed to cross through Spain to go to Morocco. So I had to go through France, through the port of Sète, and then take a ship and go 38 hours to Tangier. From the port of Sète, the port of Valéry, where Valéry wrote the Le Cimetière Marin, the graveyard by the sea. And these 38 hours promised to be a wonderful trip, but something amazing happened. There was a storm. There was a terrible storm. And my wife and I were the only non-Moroccan traveling with 120 Moroccans in the basement of the ship, because the French tourist industry invented something that they call fourth class. It was very cheap. It was made for all the workers that get into Morocco maybe in a clandestine way. Their wetbacks are Moroccan. And then with their economies, a part of their economies, they come back to Morocco in the basement of the ship. I will not it very, very long, but was very moving in all the senses of the word. The shock, the physical shock we had in the basement of the ship was something that I am sure prepared me and my wife to see and read Morocco in a different way. I began to think of everything I saw since that storm that really turned out our bodies as something with a double sense. I will explain you why. First, of course, the storm was terrible. There was a moment, I just go to the center, that our stomach was so much concentrated in itself that we had the impression that the storm didn't begin outside and got inside of us, but it began in our stomachs and it came out with anything we had in the stomachs and moved the whole sea. It was terrible. Of course, you couldn't sleep. Well, first, the place we were was planned by the designers of the ship, was a Swedish designer, even if the ship was half Moroccan, half French. The Swedish designer put this room where we were under the level of the cars, so it was smelly, and there was the place dedicated to the movies, to see the movies. So there was chairs to see a movie. There was no security bells, of course. So we were moving from one side from the other. All of you have seen movies with storms and see the people moving and getting sick. I promise you that there is a huge difference with what a storm really is. A storm is like getting into a car crash every minute, every half a minute. So your body, the ship stops against a wave and your body continues traveling. So you go from one side to the other because the ship crashes and crashes violently. And that produces an alteration of the senses, worse than any drug. Of course, we couldn't sleep. We vanished. And many hours later, when we woke up, because the local sound was announcing that we were arriving to the port of Tangiers, first class can go down, prepare to go down. Before they finished the announcement, the first class walked away. The second class won. The third class, they were already out with the second class. And when they announced the fourth class, there was not a movement. There was a whispering. So my wife and I, from the floor of the first line, stand up and saw that the whole Moroccan population was at the corner of this movie room, listening to something. So we thought, well, there is a fight or there is instructions to go down and maybe something important we have to know. We went there, and to our astonishment, what we saw was an old man telling a story. He was a short story, a conteur, a short storyteller from the square Jma el Fna de Marrakech. He was visiting someone in Morocco. And he was telling, imagine what story he was telling. He was telling the story of all of us and everything that each one of us did the night before. And as I went to the university and was one of my favorite books, I got that he was using the structure of a classical book, Das Narrenschiff, The Ship of Fools, which in each chapter describes what was called at the time the character. We now, very modern, would say the psychology of a person. But of course, as many times in the way storytellers tell the stories in Jma el Fna, that story was a joke, he was making of everything we did a humoristical tale, but at the same time was very deep humorly. There was the description of the mothers that had more than one son that wanted to tie with their shawl, the equivalent of the rebozo, with their shawl the kids, so they were fat and the kids were like a moon going around the earth. But as they have many children, there was a chaos of moons. And the way he told that was very nice and was very moving, the description of the mother trying to have all his sons having the same orbit. And there was already description of religious people, that what a real religious people do when you are about to get down into the bottom of the sea. You pray. But if you are really religious, you put the carpet and you pray over the carpet, but the carpet has to be directed through Mecca. And of course, there was a group sustaining that the Mecca was that way, and another group sustaining that the Mecca was the other way around. And 10 minutes after praying, they were fighting because each one of them was sure that they were right about where the Mecca was. He was really capturing the essence of each personality. He was joking about us, the Mexicans, because we were already notable because we were the only one that were no Moroccans there. But at the same time, we have the feeling that we understood the body language. We understood more than any European when there was something approaching you with good intention or bad intention. So we made a lot of friends, and even we made friends that we met later in the continuation of our trip. And he was telling about the Mexicans, that the Mexicans were denying the storm And instead of vomiting freely, we were containing the storm. So we kept the storm like three or four more days than all the other people. We were repressed, self-repressed people. Well, in that moment, I learned a few things. I learned that what is a classical? What is really a classical? When we go to school, we think that a classical is a book that is very famous, that is on the list of the books we should know. It's a very well-known author. There is a list of classicals. It's a duty to read them. But there, I understood that the real classic is a book that helps you to give an order, to understand the chaos of life. If there was a chaos, it was chaotic, was the storm we lived. And all the impressions were in disorder. So the classical, the Ship of Fools, was useful for that man to give an order to chaos and was able to create the way of telling us his storytelling about what we lived. In that moment, I remember that the first time I wanted to be a writer was when I was a kid and I went to the family meetings. I come from the north of Mexico, from Sonora, and all my family comes from Sonora to Mexico City. And we had a lot of family meetings. And in the family meetings, not only the grandmother and the grandfather told stories, but everybody was telling stories. And as we were a lot of time together, everybody told a story. For example, if we went to a picnic or if we went to a camping, we always had, after the travel together, what we call the dinner of reconciliation. And in the dinner of reconciliation, what happened? We didn't ask forgiveness. We told stories. And the story we told was the story that we lived together. So everybody knew how it ended. But everybody lived it in a different way. I think that because of that, I am not a fan of police novels. The idea of suspense is not really moving for me. And I can deduct, and even it happens also to my sons, and my son and my daughter, when they see a movie, what they do immediately is to propose for hypotheses and deduct what will happen. And if the movie doesn't have all the sensual, all the give to the senses, all the richness of the travel, the end of the travel is not the most interesting thing. The important thing for me in a movie, in a novel, in a story, is not how it ends. That you can deduct it. The important thing is how you lived through it. And that is completely out of the modern Protestant mind that goes to the point and is very much into the Baroque, and I will say into the Arabic way of understanding the world through all the senses. I do think that one of the ways of describing Mexican culture is Arabic. But we disguise it as Baroque. But I do think that what we can think, for many Americans and Anglo-Saxons, Baroque is a bad word, means too charged, too complicated, doesn't go to the point. Meanwhile, for us, Baroque means, since the most ancient formulation, a way, and you can see it even in the churches. When you arrive to a Baroque church, you have the show of all the gold altars going through you, you get inside and you have the show of the lights and shadows, and you are advancing through the most illuminated part of the church. And there is the music and the others. And the key idea of the Baroque is that you can get to God through the senses. Tandis que the Protestant Lutheran idea is that you can get to God only through the sense of the words. For the Baroque world, there is a geometry, and that is a key point. Baroque cannot be understood without a geometry that conducts you through a sensorial experience to one end that is out of the scene, that is not easy to pronounce. And that's the mystical moment. Well, I do think that all this conception of Baroque, and it could be described, cannot be possible without the great solutions, geometrical solutions, to give to the Baroque architects and to the Baroque painters Islamism. One of the key expressions of Baroque is in Grenade. The Grenade Baroque is different of anyone. And the Mexican Baroque, including Churrigueresque, when the Baroque is already mixed with the Indian cultures, comes from Grenade, could be traced in a more complicated way that I'm describing it now, onto the geometry of the Islamic world. The Mexican Baroque is in depth with the complex geometry of the mandalas that you have in any mosaic wall, in any important building in Morocco, in any fountain, in any kasbah, but mainly in any temple and in any Quranic school, and in many houses too. So that opens already another way of thinking what a deep trace is. But of course, I'm going already very, very, very far. What I will tell you, even if that happened later, something that I learned also and I took for myself, besides having the desire of writing as a storyteller of the Moroccan world. Hola, Jimena. Besides thinking of myself as a storyteller of the Moroccan world, I needed to accept and try to understand more, because the fact that this popular storytelling was not quoting, but even digesting a classic of the literature so sophisticated as Das Narrenschiff, meant that all these storytellers are very sophisticated. So I needed to learn more about that. And thanks to several people who studied what happened while first going to the Place Jmalna in Marrakesh, but also learning what people wrote about them, I found something that for me was very important, was the meeting with a woman, Italian woman, who was her name is Toni Maraini. The Maraini family has at least 3 very well-known people. The most famous one is the older sister, Dacia Maraini, who was a marvelous Italian writer. For a time, he was married to Alberto Moravia. He was very close to Pasolini. Her writing is amazing. I admire her much more than Moravia. I like her writings more than Moravia. And the father was an Orientalist, was an historian of cultures, Fusco Maraini. And by chance, one of my publishers in Italy, and thanks to Caterina Camastra, who is in this meeting, 2 of my books have been published by this publisher in a corner of Italy with a publisher that is also the publisher of Toni Maraini. And Toni Maraini, she's a storyteller. She was married to a Moroccan. She had Moroccan daughter and son, and she studied the storytellers and the clowns and the serpent charmers, but mainly the most sophisticated of them, who are the storytellers. And one of the things that she described to me is the principle that is called la halka. Even the phenomenon in Arabic is called al-halka. The halka is, and I would like now to share, Berenice. Could I share the screen? Do you do it or I do it? I need that you have to do it because.
Give me just 1 second.
Well, it can take a little bit time, but I can do it if you want.
No, I'll do it. Don't worry.
You'll do it? Okay.
Yes.
Well, the first image is the same novel. Well, the first one is the same book that you have that is translated as a different genre, as an essay in English, translated by Rhonda Buchanan, in Spanish as poetry, and as a novel in France and in Canada, in Quebec, by the Saint-Lucif. And the next one, this is a storyteller in Morocco. Here is with a lot of young people, but normally it's more mixed, but you can see old people too. This is what is called the halka. And one of the important things of the halka, the concept of the halka, is that the people take part of the storytelling. The people is the material that the storyteller takes to tell the story. He takes one of the people surrounding them, they participate, and in Commedia dell'arte in Italy, we can see the next. This is another genre of storyteller that is also a clown. That happens too. There is even a troupe of clowns. So that's why he's disguised more as a clown. In fact, these were five of them. And as you can see, all the young men there are very interested in what he's telling, but they are participating. You can't imagine how much. We can see the next one. This one to the left is one that was very well known. It was called Tubib al-Hasharat, which means the doctor of the insects. And one of the things that he was a leader was that the halka that he used was not only making the audience take part on it, but also making games with the words, having a lot of experiments with the words. There is even studies comparing what the older storytellers of this class make, and writers as Lawrence Stern, as Raymond Roussel, as Lewis Carroll, for example. And the Oulipo, this workshop of experimental writing, all of that is made by these storytellers. The one in the right have some sacred, you can see that he has some classical illustrations. Some of them are from the Quran, but not all of them. One of the interesting things I found, and it's also very well studied, is that these storytellers use something that is called the Maqamat. The Maqamat is a classical book, and there's even a genre. Al-Hariri was the writer, contemporary, at least a little bit younger than Ibn Hazm, was a writer who wrote 50 stories. And these 50 stories, we can see the next one. Well, here is the halqa, the circle. You can see that sometimes there is even parallel storytellers. The next one. This is an illustration, this is a facsimile of the Al-Hariri Maqamat. It's a wonderful book. It's really full of funny stories. And all these stories is like the nourishment for making interventions, as they are 50. There is many ways of taking the people surrounding the story and made them part of what he's telling. He proposes the audience to participate. He proposes to give an answer to a guessing riddle. It's really fabulous. One of the things that they do a lot is to make palindromic games. You know, a palindrome is, for example, one verse that you read in one sense, and a classic palindrome, if you read it in the other sense, if you begin by the last word, it is the same reading. But they build stories that if you read it in one sense, has one ending, the story, but if you read it in the opposite, it has another sense of the story, another development. We can see the next, and I think that this is one of them, also the beautiful illustrations. They are amazing. Well, the Maqamat is a fabulous story, and it belongs to one trend of the Islamic world in which the principle is not to obey the order of the religious patriarch, but to introduce reflection and do what you think is better. That is a whole trend of Islamic that people doesn't pay attention because of all the fundamentalism. People think only of the forbiddenness of images, but the fact and the story is much more complex than that. Much more complex. They are not breaking a rule. They are obeying a rule. And the way of obeying the rule here is producing beauty and making for the teachings of the text beauty. That is very important. And we can go, I think that the next one, let me see which one is. We can stop a little bit. Wait, yes, we can stop a little bit. Because I want to tell you, we can return to we can take out the sharing square. Well, another one of the teachings there, and the first impressions you have going to an Arabic country and to Morocco that is so much linked to America. Even Umama was the director of a festival that happened in this city, Mogador, and it was a festival dedicated to establish the link between this part of the Arabic world, the Maghreb, and America, and the whole America. It was a very important effort with a lot of consequences. There was even Canadian writers that were amazing. One of them was a a Canadian writer close to the Beat Generation, who in a clandestine way, stole cactus from Mexico, from San Miguel de Allende. And through the years, he made a Mexican garden in the outskirts of Mogador. You know, the cactus in each desert are different. In the Sahara, there is no one of the cactuses that you can find almost no one of the cactuses that you can find in Mexico. So to have a traveling Mexican garden in Morocco is one of the magic situations that happen when you have crazy Canadians, Mexicans, and Moroccans doing something unexpected together. But, well, one of the main things that I understood immediately, even without understanding the language, was that many words were exactly the same. But, you know, we are all used to know that the word that begins with AL are from Arabic origin. That's the easy part of it. But to understand that everyday words, like, for example, aceite, is Arabic. And when you say aceite, you are speaking Arabic. And the fact that like that, there is a lot of them, much more than you can imagine, is something that is astonishing. And for me, it was more astonishing because, for example, we have aceite, and in Mexico, we eat aceitunas. But in Colombia and in Spain, they eat olives. That meant that there was an effort to substitute Arabic words with words from Latin origin. And I began to try to listen how that, and I found a lot of words, but really a lot. For that, in my first book, in Los Nombres del Aire, one of the things that I tried to do was to include a lot of words in that one, yes. A lot of words from Arabic origin, but not the evident ones, but the not evident ones. So that the book was in a great proportion written in Arabic without noticing that it was made that way. I wanted to talk about the traces, but the deep traces again. And yeah, yes, Mama is showing one of the people who studied the language, one of the most amazing books, and I really recommend to anyone who wants to know anything about our language, I recommend to read it. It's a book by Antonio Alatorre. Antonio Alatorre was a Mexican specialist of literature, and he was asked, he was a linguist and he was a wonderful person. He was asked to write a history of the Spanish language for everybody, what they call work of divulgación. And he wrote a book called 1001 años de la lengua española. It's published by El Fondo de Cultura. You can always get it. 1001 nights of the Spanish language. And one of the things he says is that in daily today Spanish, there is 4,000 words of Arabic origin. 4,000. You know that many young people have a language of 20. That one, yes, Berenice, that one. But many young people have a vocabulary of 20 words, 100 words. This is already a lot. 4,000 words from Arabic origin means a lot. So I was very enthusiastic enthusiastic of talking with him. And without asking, he got my first book, and he noticed that immediately. Even when my book was presented into Spanish, the book was presented by Antonio Alatorre. And all of my friends said, no, you know, he's very rude. He will be mean. He will say something horrible about your book. But I said, well, doesn't matter. If the book deserves something bad, let's hear it. Because I trusted that he was really a wonderful, sabio sageman. And the book was introduced by him and by Álvaro Mutis, who was also very documented on the Arabic world. And he was very generous, of course. But what I learned also from Antonio Alatorre, and talking with him much more, was that the semantic fields to which many of these words belonged. The semantic field is, you know, for example, how many of those words are related to love? How many of those words are related to war? Well, almost 80% of these words come from the field of what we call now applied arts. The reason of that is simpler than we can think, and at the same time complex. And that is linked to something that immediately getting out of the book we discovered. When we went out of the book and we got into the market, we discovered that the pottery, the ceramics, as Farsi explained you the last week, was very similar to the one in Mexico. The Mexican Talavera de Puebla, or ceramics from Guanajuato or from Hidalgo, was very similar to the one we saw in Tangier. And in Tangier, I asked where it was made. And the one that was more blue-like was made in Fez, the Bleu de Fez. And the one that was with more variety, with a longer variety of colors, was very similar to the one made in Hidalgo. And it was made in the town of Safi, in the Atlantic coast. So why these geological locations, also of the two main geological locations of the same pottery in Mexico? It was quite amazing. Yeah, it's almost the hour. Oh, I will go faster. Well, the story was told by Farsi the last time. So, but we saw the same in some textiles, and the same in architecture. What was the meaning of that? Linked to the fact that most of the words alive from Arabic origin were from those fields, is what happens with technology. Why do we use the word Google to Google? Because we don't have a word in Spanish for that. And it is absolutely stupid to invent a word for that. It doesn't exist. Or what do we fax? Or what many others. So even if there was a very important enterprise directed by one of the Spanish cultural heroes, Antonio de Nebrija, Elio Antonio de Nebrija, his enterprise consisted in one thing that was very important for the Spanish, was to make the first grammar and the first vocabulary of the Spanish. But his third goal was to take out from the language all the words from Arabic origin and exchange them for words from Italian origin, Latin origin. It's needed to say that the importance of that effort was because at that time, and it's 1492, the same year of the discovery of America, the Spanish was not considered a language that merited to have a dictionary nor a grammar. So he gave the importance of that. But at the same time, he was making a racial cleaning of the language, getting out of it all the words of Arabic origin that he could substitute. Elio Antonio de Nebrija was so snob that Nebrija is an Italianism, but his real name was Rodriguez. He was from the south of what was called La Bética in the Roman times, but when he was born, it was called Sevilla. He was from the south of Sevilla, and his name was Toño Rodriguez. But he changed his name for the name of a Roman general and an Italian name from the place he was born, Elio Antonio de Nebrija. So you can see the snobbish attempt, but also the big effort that was important for the Spanish. It's important to say that the Arabic was 7 centuries older than the Spanish. The Arabic evolved in many ways. What Nebrija did was not a dictionary, but a vocabulary. So he made a list of Italian words, or Latin words, sorry, and a list of Spanish words. Well, that same operation was made 5 centuries before with the Arabic. There was many vocabularies of Arabic and Latin, because Arabic was complex enough to have a very strong and important grammar. One of the things that astonished me most was the different nature of dictionaries, for example, in the Arabic world of the time and in the actual Spanish world. And one of the things that I found the most, and we talk about this with Juan Goytisolo. Do you remember, Umama, in one session you organized when you invited me to have a conversation with Juan Goytisolo about this, and we were talking about this. And I was talking with him about one of the words that matters me the most, that is the word asombro, wonder, because it changed now, but still in the 21st edition of the Dictionary of the Royal Academy of Spain, the word asombro the definition of the word asombro was first to throw a shadow over something clear. Second, to put something in the shadow of the emotions, so something sad. Third, to be scared. Me asombra, I'm scared. And fourth, wonder. When I talked to, I was invited even to write a letter to the Academy of the Language. And they explained to me that was because it was a historical, they made a historical evolution. And I said, well, you need to change that, because for me, asombro is not mainly and first being scared or being shadowed. They changed it now in the last edition. But one of the important things that is that with a friend, I read an Arabic dictionary, and the logic of the way to give a definition to words is different. It's almost like a phenomenological definition. It's very, very different. The way they act is this. They say asombro. They say first, is the experience you have when you are in front of something new or different that moves you intellectually towards amazement. That is the definition of wonder. So it's a definition where you have body and soul, and that is explainable because, you know, in the Arabic philosophy, Avicenne, Ibn Sina, considered that there was 5 kinds of soul, but none of them was not linked to the body. So this definition is deeper and is much more in harmony with what we do. I'm really I'm invited to conclude. Of course, I have to tell you that, continuing with the definition of the deep trace, a deep trace is much more than a trace because it's a trace you have in the soul. And one of the things that I learned is some technology to build my novels. I will go very fast through the images. If we can do it, Berenice. You can see, well, that pottery is from Morocco. The colors are very similar to the ones in the west, in the west of Morocco and in the west of Mexico. Next. This textile, well, the last one. This textile, with its rhomboid forms, is Moroccan. The next one is Mexican. I was working with Fatima Mernissi. This one is Moroccan. The next one, this is Mexican. But there is some very similar in Morocco. This is Mexican. This is Berber, but at the same time is very similar to one made in Chiapas with a cross and everything. The explanation is that all these things, this is Mexican, but as we found, is very similar to one made in Tunisia. This is Moroccan. Could be, people sometimes think that she's from the north of Mexico. You can see the flower. Mexican, of course. Again, this is the roofs, because you can see the roofs made of wood. All the roofs at the beginning, while the first 2 centuries of Spanish presence in Mexico were made with a technology that was called Carpintería de lo Blanco. It was the Spanish trace in Mexico in architecture is from Arabic origin. Again, this is another one. This one is from Tlaxcala. And this is the mandala you can find. So when I was trying to learn something for my books, I decided that the variety of text I had needed to have a form, and that form needed to have a sense. The sense of a search, all my characters, and in the search of desire, understanding desire, and understanding the loved one. And what we can find here with any malem, any master doing this, is a way of giving an order to the chaos. These tiles are made by the malem, developing 99 forms, and making with the 99 forms this kind of mandala. Next. So I tried to write 5 books, like if there were 5 circles that were in communication one with the other. You can see this. This is very important because if you need to put together 99 different forms, the technology you need to develop has to be very, very to spend a lot of energy finding the common formula to communicate. So what they developed was this, that has also an Indian origin and made by the Arabic culture in the north of India. It's called the Vedic square, Vedic, which means the knowledge, the books, the Vedic books is the books of knowledge. You can see that you have nine unities, nine. And what do you do if you say, let's put together each one of these numbers? Next one. You can see, for example, here, if you put together some of the ciphers, you put together the 4, you get this form. If you put together the 5, you get this form. If you put together the 6, you get this form. If you put together the 3, you get this form. So the 9 times 9 allows us to develop a formula in common for different shapes. It's a principle of composition and at the same time, a mystique of composition. It works, as you can see, and it works also for calligraphy, as you can see. Next, it's Caterina knows a lot because Caterina went to Morocco, put herself under the orders of a Malem, and these are by Hassan Masudi. And she became a calligrapher. And as Caterina will talk about it, to do this is not a craft, it's an initiation. I am very grateful that her final work of initiation, next, was, and next, to develop the calligraphies of my book, of 9 veces el asombro. Well, one of the things that you cannot planify is what happens with your books. I publish my books, one of the characters is a calligrapher, one of the characters have that as a tattoo, and I began to receive photographs of mainly women, but also men, who made of that a tattoo. And I asked all of them why they did it. To my astonishment, every one of them made it for a different reason. So there is an edition of the Quintet of Mogador in the skin of its readers. I have 158 tattoos with stories in different parts of the body. Some of them very daring that I don't show, but look, these are guys, very few guys, but they exist too. Well, this is upside down, no, but this is a typical Fez ceramics that have a poem written. It's very nice, and it's badly situated, but it's a poem, Palestinian poem, and I love this one because the calligraphy is made by common people. It's not really a designer doing it. And the last book of the Quintet of Mogador begins with this, the last one, we will go to this one. The last one. This is the beginning of the novel because one of the main character dies, and when the forensic police arrive to see the body, they show him this piece, and he looks inside and there is nothing, not even ashes, because he asked his ashes to become the glaze. The ashes are very good to do glazes. So the body of the main character becomes a work of art. The next one. So this is one of the calligraphies by Caterina Camastra, and one of the, I love what she did, and she made almost 90 of them, because the book has 81 paragraphs and many other words from Arabic origin in Spanish. We can go next. That's some of the things. It's a simpler calligraphy, and this is the edition of the Quintet. I need to tell you that all the what happened with this book have been for me magical. I spent 30 years doing that. I interview a lot of women. I studied a lot of principles of composition. And when I tried to publish my books in Spain, it was for them too much problem to publish 5 books. So they did it together in one book with the one of the walls of the Alhambra and this beautiful woman there. So the book existed. I was invited to a festival, literary festival in Jaipur. And there, that festival is a very good one because no journalist can interview you if they don't know your books. The only journalist who read your books can make an interview with you. And there is like 90 writers. It's a huge festival, very fun. So I had a journalist who was an anthropologist, was a fighter of human rights. And it was a very good interview. It was very few interviews, 3, but all of them were wonderful. And the best was this girl. And at the end, she said, I have to confess you that I'm a character in your book. And I imagine that she was saying, well, I'm identified with one of the characters, etc. And she said, well, in which way you are a character? I am in the cover of your book. So the girl was this one that by chance is imagine an Indian journalist from Calcutta that goes with a scholarship to study anthropology to London, where an Egyptian photographer took her photo, sold it to an agency, and I'm invited to the the designer, the graphic designer in Spain buys the photo, puts together this. I'm invited to Jaipur, and there I find the main character of the cover. For me, it's absolutely magical. And everything that happened with this book is magical. Sorry, Berenice, I need to tell you only, we began a little bit late, but I will tell you a conclusion. I have to read it. What did I receive from all my relationship with the Arabic world? I received 9 gifts. The gift of friendship and warmth from my Moroccan friends. 2, the gift of being close to a marvelous country, Morocco, and a marvelous city, Mogador. 3, the gift of the unexpected remembrance of my forgotten early childhood in the Sonora Desert. 4, that's another story to tell. 4, the gift of a poetics of wonder. 5, the gift of an extended erotic conception of life in which there is always a search, a path, a spiritual dimension. 6, the gift of technical narrative lessons taken from the traditional Arabic crafts and thought. 7, the gift of discovering an aesthetic dimension of life, present and alive in every corner of that country and my country. 8, the gift of a new territory, another dimension of Mexican culture, the Andalusi one, another way of understanding Mexico and my mestizaje. And 9, the gift of a different understanding of who I am, of what I am becoming, of what I do and can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto. This is wonderful.
I told you that you needed to stop me.
Thank you, Alberto. This is a fantastic presentation, and it's interesting that you mentioned how the Protestant way, to go to the point, and how it's very, different to the, I want to say Mexican and maybe the Moroccan way. So, thank you for those of you who stayed with us, half past the scheduled hour. We appreciate it. I have to be honest, I need to follow a little bit our Protestant ethics over here. And we unfortunately don't have a lot of time for questions, but we do appreciate your presentation and we appreciate everyone who is here. We're seeing through the chat a lot of thank yous and, commending for the presentation. So we, again, really appreciate these. Everyone, thank you so much. We hope, Alberto, we will have a chance to bring you in person so you can keep telling us stories, at least a couple of more days, if not a couple of more nights. So thank you everyone for joining us, staying with us, and we will have this presentation. If you missed a little bit, for those who were a bit confused with the hour, we will have this presentation on our YouTube channel later, probably today or tomorrow morning. And we invite you again to follow us in social media, both to the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, our colleagues at the Institute of Islamic Studies, and our good friends and colleagues in ICE Americas. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. And if you don't mind, the first 5 people who were with me for the technical issues, could you stay a little longer, please? Thank you, everyone. Have a good night or a good day wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Maestro Rui Sánchez, buenas noches, soy Salvador Sánchez.
Hola Salvador, ¿cómo estás?
He seguido, muy bien, muchas gracias. He seguido su trayectoria, pues bueno, porque me encuentro haciendo una investigación doctoral sobre el neomexicanismo. Y pues me gustaría saber, en la medida de lo posible, entiendo que está usted con mucho trabajo, si le puedo dejar mi correo, y le es posible contactarme después para hacerle una breve entrevista. Yo le mandaría las preguntas, si es que usted puede. Y
te doy el mío mejor, porque...
bueno, sí.
Pero advierto que soy bastante desordenado.
No se preocupe, yo tengo paciencia.
Si no responde, me insistes.
Claro que sí.
albertorruy@gmail.com. Sí, soy terrible desordenado. Y ahora más. Además, con el teléfono, todo lo que ya queda atrás se pierde.
Claro. Muchísimas gracias. Se lo repito, albertorruy@gmail.com.
Sí.
Muchísimas gracias.